From the studios in Joplin, Missouri, Good News Productions International presents Venture in Faith. Outstanding Christians of our generation telling their own story of how God has worked in their lives. Your host, Boyce Moten.
Our guest today on Ventures in Faith is Riley Donica, Kiamichi Mountain Mission, Honebby, Oklahoma. We're going to be talking about the Great Commission and in particular about the last part of the Great Commission. The first part says go, and then we're to make disciples, and then we're to baptize, and then we're to stick around and continue to teach. And that's what you've done, isn't it, Riley?
Yes, that's been a primary thrust of our ministry in the Kiamichis, to provide a ministry where it would not ordinarily be had. And it's important to go somewhere and preach, and we're grateful for that in the mountains, but the rub really comes when you have somebody that'll stick around and, well, like Jesus said, teach them to observe all things whatsoever I have commanded you. And that sometimes is a very difficult task. And men are to be commended that will do that, and we've committed ourselves to that task.
You know, it would have been easier for Peter to have gone off to anywhere to preach other than Jerusalem, wouldn't it? Because he had denied the Lord 3 times right there, and that's where all the hostility was, in Jerusalem.
Right. He could have, if he'd have been smart, he'd went somewhere else, because that's where the heat was on, really.
Okay, now let's talk about the heat that's been on you and some of the other preachers down there to get out.
Well, actually, at the time that these things happen, Boyce, they're very serious. When you look to them in the past, they are sometimes humorous, and it sounds like just a story. But you can talk to the men that have been involved in these things, and if you want a real good story about it, talk to my wife, who was with me through all of this activity. And she wasn't really, she did not take casually some of the things that I was able to take as routine in dealing with a crisis, because I grew up in the mountains. I had this advantage over most of the other missionaries there. I was born in the Kiamichis, as was my father, and some of the ways that they would treat a New England Yankee missionary were not really tried on me. Consequently, I was in a unique position to do something that maybe no one else could really do. And what you're really talking about in this is the fact that, first of all, we had to overcome a problem and stand. And I would like to mention that because my venture in faith is based on something that someone else did. When, for example, in the Honebby community, where we have Christ 40 Acres and the headquarters of the Kiamichi Mountains Mission, and where we have the annual men's clinic the first week in May each year, when I first became acquainted with the evangelistic effort that Brother McReynolds had started there, Jim Irby was the preacher, and actually James Irby the second. There's a James Irby the third around, and I'm sure by now James Irby the fourth. But anyway, Jim and his lovely wife Jeanette were at Honebby, and they were dead serious about having a church at Honebby, and the whole community was just thrilled. They were for it. But they had this horrible fear that, like every other preacher that had ever come there, he had stayed there for just a little while and then go on somewhere else. Sometimes he left because of one reason, sometimes another. But anyway, the Irbys were staying, and they then started building a building. And people were so thrilled over this building, but they'd say, well, we'll never get the walls up. You know, preacher will leave. And the walls would be up, then we'll never get the roof on it. even though they were helping put it on. You know, they were off there working like Turks, you know, but they still did not really believe it would stay. Never get the windows in it, never have a service in it. And then
part of that is attributed, isn't it, to the fact that the whole history of these people, even back in the days of Indian territory, that outsiders would run in and then run out.
Right, that's the whole deal. And some of them would be run out. I mean, that was one case in point in the thing. And not just the preachers, but occasionally, if a school teacher was there, somebody didn't like, the way you made a point to get rid of that school teacher was burn the schoolhouse. That's happened. But in any case, this was sort of the background of it, and other problems entered into it. The ministers left because of the financial problems, and some left because of unrest in the community that they were not used to dealing with. And then occasionally somebody would leave because he felt his life was in danger. And not all of these preachers were necessarily ours. Other people had the idea of staying, but we just happened to be the people that did stay. Anyway, against this backdrop, I came to preach at the church at Zafra, a work that started by Bob Warfel, and Jane and I stayed there a long time. And we, while there, we started the church over at Panther Creek. And to make a long story short in this, we started in a schoolhouse in the Free Center community, and that building was moved. Then we retreated to Brushy Ridge, where we had services, until we got a building built over on a crossroads on Highway 4 near the head of a little creek called Panther Creek. And we selected that spot. It was on the first hard surface road in the country. In fact, it's still the only one. And near crossroads that led into other communities. We thought it'd be an ideal place, and it is. And I served both congregations for about 10 years. Well, we had just got this first building built, and a community situation developed that made this venture of faith, and it really was that. About a mile east of where we built the Panther Creek Church building was a place called Dog Patch. Dog Patch was simply a tavern in an acre of beer cans. It was near the Arkansas line, and it had a notorious reputation. There have been people that have been killed there. There have been times there have been 4 or 5 taverns running at once, but they burn each other out and only the tough survive. And it had the usual reputation. And all of it, I want to point out, like most tough places, the guy that runs it is not in on everything that happens there. You know, if there was a guy stealing merchandise in Texas and somebody else stealing merchandise in Missouri, and they were going to meet and trade merchandise and then sell each other stuff, you know, where the heat wasn't on, they're liable to say, let's meet at Dog Patch. And the guy that runs it may not know anything about that. So lots of things went on he wasn't in on, but nevertheless, it was a place where it was known that if you stole, somebody could steal a tire off the pickup, trade it to someone at Dog Patch, trade it for beer, get a chainsaw. It helped create a problem. Well, we didn't have any sheriff in the northern part of McCurtain County. That's up in the mountains. County seat down there then acted as if the county ended at the city limits north of Broken Bow, and we were left without any law enforcement there generally. Well, myself and 2 or 3 fellows went down and persuaded the county commissioners to come up with a partial salary for a fellow, a Korean War veteran that had got shot up pretty bad and had been in police work in the Army, who had agreed to be our sheriff. And he made us a good officer. Well, anyway, to shorten the story again, the tavern operator killed him. I wrote an article about it in the church paper, and then a few days later the church building burned. And I was thrust into a situation that preachers don't normally find themselves. It's a little bit humorous now, but there, just a few days before, had been another killing related to this thing that I still have questions about. We had just gotten telephones in our community, and people would call me and say, Riley, sometimes they would not identify themselves, but just as a friend, say, I want to tell you that you're in trouble. Well, I believed it. I mean, I knew what was going on, but also I was irritated by it. I wrote the article on a Tuesday.
What did you say in the article that was so
I just simply said that we had a situation that should have been handled a long time before, and now that an effort had been made, we had had this tragedy take place.
That is the murder
the murder of the deputy, and then I said that the...
Did anybody at that time know who did it?
Yes. A young man drove up right in the middle of the deal when it happened and saw it, even though he was not able to be a real good witness at the trial. That actually that muddied the pond enough that the officers pretty well knew who to go get. And so we had a suspect in jail. But here's what made this so tense, and the gist of my article was that we had a situation that we'd let go so long that it produced a tragedy. The second thing was that we had a good live suspect, and the general consensus of opinion was we would never have a trial because those who should testify would be afraid to. And county people would probably be afraid to sit on a jury, and especially if they rendered a guilty verdict. So this fear, I said that's the second tragedy, that we ought not live in fear in this country. And I said we had a good live suspect. He should be tried, and if he is convicted, then he should receive the death penalty. If he is tried and it's inadequately, and the evidence is inadequate to convict him, he should be acquitted. But nobody ought to have live in fear, not in this country. That was the gist of the article that I'd written. And the church paper that I put out went to everybody. It wasn't that I thought everybody would be interested in what I wrote. Turned out a lot of people were. But if I mailed it to everybody, I didn't have to address it, and I had to do it by hand. And I know, Boyce, how you and I both love office work. And so I mailed it to everybody, and so it got all over the country. The governor got a copy of the thing, and I went to Oklahoma City. I got an old airplane, and the sheriff of Polk County, Arkansas, went with me to Oklahoma City, and Senator Henry Bellman was then governor of the state. And he'd set me up with Dale Cook, who's now a federal judge, and Earl Gerke, who is an attorney at Enid, Oklahoma, who is head of the Oklahoma Crime Bureau, a special investigative unit for the state of Oklahoma. They're kind of Oklahoma's version to the Texas Ranger. They're a very small, compact group. At that time, they had a limit of 15 men, and I think they were down to 12 or 13 when this incident happened. And the men on it are geniuses. They got some real young men and some old pros and some real old pros, but you're picked for your capability. But anyway, in talking to these men, they made me aware that I really could be in danger. They did not know if the man who did the killing, they thought he might belong to a syndicate, because his place, the name just cropped up in too high a percentage of investigations of certain types of crime. And it's my opinion that he was not, that he was just an independent operator that ran a country tavern that got rowdy and rough. And one of the rules of thumb on that is that he, it took all his money. He didn't have an unlimited source of funds to buy attorneys and things like that. And if he'd been syndicated, I'm sure that there would have been more cash available. But in any case, I I was really concerned, and my wife was terrified to a point, and I might say, though, that one thing that let this burden off, all my neighbors can shoot. Nobody could slip around the place without being detected or treed by somebody's dog. And so it was not as empty-headed as it sounds. The defense perimeter is fairly natural, even when there's nothing going on. So, but these phone calls built up the tension even more. Then I decided at that time that I ought not have to change my routine too much, because it's contrary to my principles to allow criminal activity to deter what I have a right to do as a citizen.
All right, but now let's go back to it. You wrote this article.
Right.
Now didn't they burn down the church house?
Well, not right then.
Not right
I wrote
then.
the article, and it created quite a stir. Went to see the governor, all this thing, and then I went to hold a revival meeting over at Shelbyville, Missouri, where Jim Oliver, who's now up at Roseville, Illinois, was minister at the time. And then on Tuesday night, the church burned.
How long was this after the article?
Well, it was approximately 10 days.
10 days.
Yeah. Well, I wrote the article Tuesday. Went to the post office Wednesday, went out on the route Thursday, you know, and all that. So, and anyway, the church burned on Tuesday night. I had an old airplane then, and the next morning at the crack of dawn, I had that thing going towards home. And I was angry beyond description, mad as I could get. And one of the things, I knew exactly what I could do about it. And it wasn't polite and an upfront deal, but I really felt alone. The Crime Bureau people had given me a phone number and said if anything serious happened to call them. Well, when my wife called and said the church is burning, I said call that number, and I just knew the cavalry would be right on its way. Well, it wasn't. I got home and went out to the ruins of the church, and then went to the house where my family was and found out some people were looking for me. So I wondered what I ought to do. And my wife is kind of a mind reader, and she's got no real confidence in the Donicas doing things up front like you ought to. And she made the statement that maybe if these people knew what you were thinking about, if they really knew, it might turn this whole thing around. So I thought maybe that's right. Maybe if they knew I was not a pacifist, and believe also that it is morally wrong and unscriptural for anybody to be under these conditions, that maybe if they understood that, they would be more careful about what they plan. Now, boys, the one thing that spurred me on in this was this. I grew up in the Comishes, and I know what it's like to live in a community that doesn't have a preacher. And I've been to the cemetery where, well, when someone dies, you send somebody out in a different direction to try to locate a preacher. And you show up at 1 in the afternoon, and a preacher that you've never met, never been in that country, they've gone all the way to Paris, Texas after him or something, shows up at 3 or 4 to preach the funeral. And I realized that after a preacher coming into the area had managed to achieve a financial stability and also maybe achieve a functional capability financially called a service link, he had managed to live out the school board fights and all the other kind of things that disturb a community, get a church building built, all this stuff. And finally, at last, our preachers and our work, that of the Comiskey Mountain Mission, the word was getting around, when these folks show up, they stay. And so there was a new level of confidence that was generated in this work for the Lord. And it dawned on me that if burning the church house and the threats on the phone caused me to run away, you know, and nobody would have blamed me, then it wouldn't have happened to everybody. But I do know, I mean, down in Allen one time, people got upset at the school teacher, they burned the schoolhouse. And if they found out that all you had to do to run the preacher off is burn the church house, then I would be letting all this work down and opening up to something
lawless element?
Yeah, that they didn't deserve. You know, if you learn what will run your enemy off, all you got to do is that. And anyway, so I realized that I've got us in this mess, and I didn't want to feel wrong in writing what I did, and I'd like to come out winning. And I decided what I had to do. There was an opinion over there that if you crossed this element at Dog Patch, you were in trouble. Well, I decided that I need to change that around. If they crossed me, they were in trouble. And in other words, I was not in trouble, they were. Well, I decided, after my good wife's advice, that maybe if they knew, but again, she didn't know how I was going to put this out, I suppose. So this was Wednesday. Thursday morning, I went down to the second tavern, or two taverns involved in this, and knocked on the front door. And 8 o'clock in the morning. And these people they came to the door and let me in. And they assumed, now the Crime Bureau had not showed up yet. The sheriff was essentially not functioning.
They had killed one already.
Had already killed one already. And had one officer, a fellow named Gene Thorpe, that I had a great deal of confidence in, and who later became sheriff of the county. But by the time I got home, the Crime Bureau wasn't there, all this sort of thing. And so I felt really all alone, that I was by myself. And
did you pray before you went?
Well, yeah, but I also now, before I tell you what I did, I want to say that I did not. Some people say, there you go, flying off the handle, taking the law in your own hands and all that. But boys, let me tell you the little mental procedure that I went to arrive that I should do this legally. The Constitution of the United States gives limited and designated powers to the federal government. The balance are reserved for the states and to the people themselves. Well, the federal government was not interested in my situation. The state, I'd talked to the highest law enforcement officers in the state, and they had not showed up yet. Evidently, they had not took it seriously. That was my thought at the moment. And the county government was not functioning, either through inept situations or fear. Now that leaves it with me. And it is my opinion that I have the constitutional right, that the Constitution places in my hands and in your hands the responsibility to defend your life, liberty, and property. In any affair, we'll be glad to allow agencies of our government to do it for us. That's what we've got them for. But I'd like to say that I believe that if they default, the liberty that the Founding Fathers says came from God grants me the right to function. And that was my feeling. Now, I've gave this to a group of attorneys one time, made a presentation, and it raised some eyebrows, but one attorney that I know who's never lost a case before the federal court, Supreme Court, says that that is good thinking and that it is a good legal thing. In fact, he encouraged me to write it up as a brief and present it to the Bar Association to see if it'd hold water. But I'm not talking about the legality of it. I'm talking about the mentality of it. I'm talking about, in fact, still yet today, that's my thinking, and that's what a criminal has to do when he's dealing with me. I'll let every law enforcement agent in the world handle it. But if they're not around, I will take care of it myself if I can pull it off. And I believe that that's part of the constitutional guarantee. But anyway, I got my pistol, and I can shoot a pistol better than anybody you've met in the last 5 minutes, you know. And I knocked on the tavern door. They thought I was a law enforcement officer because you don't normally see people carrying open holstered 6-shooters. They let me in, and I had one expert help with me, who was later bushwhacked and killed by cattle thieves, by the way, and that's another story. But a gentleman that had a lot of experience in situations like this, and we went in the tavern. And the way this thing is set up, I don't know how long that building was. It was probably 60 feet long, maybe more, and the bar was across the long side of it, and then front door over here, and back behind here was a little short bar that they sold sandwiches and things. Back that way were living quarters, and I went down to the end of the bar here, and my help stood in that corner, and they came and asked what they could do for me. And I said, my name is Riley Donica. I'm the minister of the Panther Creek Church. I understand that you people were looking for me, and I wonder what I could do for you. Well, there were, I believe, 7 people in the tavern. 1 woman and 6 men. One of these men had been involved in the killing that I mentioned previously, not the killing of the deputy. Another one that was related. Don't have time to work into this story. And I've had some dealings with him since. But when I told them who I was, there's no way to describe what happened there. Because I'm in a room full of toughs, and they are tough. But they got nervous right then. It got awfully quiet, and the feedback from what they told other people later is interesting because it was told humorously. It came out that way. But there is something scary about a mad preacher standing against the wall with his hand near a pistol saying, what can I do for you? It's something most folks haven't faced. And even though these guys have been in tough deals, they didn't know about that. And they also believe I'm a practical person, and that's right. I am. The old man I had with me was a whiz. And they also believe that I probably had riflemen stationed on the outside, and they will never know whether I did or not. But anyway, at this point, they kind of regrouped, and I said, I want to know what you want to see me about. And there was some stammering. Then they jumped on about what I had written, and I took the ball away from them and said, I'll stick by that. And that should be said, was said. And they could tell I was angry and mad, and I was looking for somebody to do something sour and was prepared to handle it. And but anyway, the tone of the thing began to change a little. I explained what I came to tell them. And I did. I took the time, boys, to tell them how I thought. I explained to these people that any criminal element must leave its victim or the citizen confidence in the courts. Now, the reason for this is,
Now, come back and say that one more time.
okay, any criminal element. You know, if you got a lot of crime going on in the community,
Okay.
the criminals must remember, now they like to get where they think they control the courts, and there's two ways they control it. And I told them this, either through outright purchase or default of the citizenry. And my firm opinion is that there are far fewer courts bought off than we think. The reason we're getting what we're getting is people don't vote and people won't sit on juries. You know, I mean, all that, but default of the citizenry. But I explained to the people that if something is done to a citizen, you want him to have enough confidence in the court, the criminal, if the criminal does something, that he will not handle it himself, that he will trot down to the courthouse and visit the district attorney and file. It'll go to a grand jury or whatever the procedure might warrant, and if it comes up for trial, you win some and lose some. But a criminal element in a society must leave society, the citizenry, enough confidence in the court that if he is the victim of a crime, they got to know he'll go right down to the courthouse and file and go through his procedure like every good citizen should. But if, either by the fact that the criminal element through tyranny or outright purchase or just plain laziness on part of the citizen, which is, again, I say the big case. You can scare a few and buy a few, but the big problem is the fact that citizens won't stick in there. And it just takes, you get to electing judges and sitting on juries, you can turn things around in a few years. But if they get so rough that you can't, you know, that you have no confidence in the court, then you do something to a citizen, and I'm telling them this. You know, this is not just background. They're sitting there and they're listening. If the churches I preach at listen as good as they did,
Maybe you ought to wear it when you preach. It might help.
Good. Well, might. But they, I emphasize that if something happened to a citizen and he feels that it's going to be worse and he's scared because of his property and his family and all this sort of thing, and I'd had a couple of things happen, like the church building in Zafra. There was an attempt to blow it up. And I stumbled into that deed, into that. And it was just the Lord looking after me that it didn't happen. And there was one attempted bushwhacking. And a lady, some might say a shady lady that I had befriended one time, gave a phone call that sent me another direction on this errand. There was an effort to cause me to have a wreck, and then I'm sure that if I'd have got my head bumped, it would have been a fatality. So I had all kinds of things to make me think I was in trouble. And but anyway, I simply explained to them that if the citizen was a victim of a crime and he felt like it had to be handled some way, and he knew it wasn't going to be handled in court, you got no choice but to handle it yourself. And I said, that's where I am. And so I have come to tell you, I said, I am here for one purpose, and that's to tell you how I feel. You are not dealing with what has happened. They were trying to tell me that, oh, the man didn't kill the deputy, we didn't burn the church, we don't know what happened and all that. I told them, I said, I'm trying hard to believe you. Find it rather difficult. But I realize there is a possibility, you know, that people don't like you, they go burn the church and blame. In fact, I don't believe the killer had anything to do with burning the church. I believe that too. I think it was done by somebody who thought they'd shut me up, or an enemy of his who thought it'd put more heat on him. But either way, it happened. And the thing just kept mushrooming in here. And so I emphasized that I was going to, they were dealing with what was in my head. It's not what you have done, but what I believe you've done. It's not guilt or innocence, but what's in my head. It's not what you plan to do. Maybe all of y'all are going to start to church this Lord's Day. Help me build the building back. All of that. It's got nothing to do with that. You are dealing not with your conduct in the past or your good intentions, but you're dealing with what's in my head. And the word keeps floating around. There was a rumor that the officer would be killed and he's dead. There was a rumor that the church would burn, and it burned. And now the rumor is that you're saying that something's got to be done about that preacher. And I said I said, I've got a good-looking wife, and I don't want her to be a widow just yet. And I explained to them, if I get up out of the bed some morning, maybe didn't sleep good, maybe Mama burns the biscuits, get a sassy phone call from somebody that didn't like the sermon, you know. And then I've been hearing all these threats and suspicions, maybe for no reason at all, and it might be contrary to what you intend. I may be, it comes through my head that you intend my family or myself harm or our work in this area. I said, the day I decide that, this is the phrase I used. I said, you won't stand a chance of ice cube in hell, because I can outshoot anybody you know. I know about kerosene and matches, and I know more tough people than you do. And I'm not bluffing on any count. You know, the truth is, where you preach, those guys sitting out there, they fought in every war since 1812. They're good people, and they're tough people. They just choose to live a peaceful life. But I'll guarantee you, the people that make up the first 4 rows of the church, the men in that church, can whip all the criminal elements in any given county in Missouri if they simply decide to choose to be tough. Now, I thought I might have been, this is a venture in faith, I thought I was overstepping my case, because I really thought, I knew it was abandoned by the county, and I thought the state had abandoned me. But really it was the Lord just looking out after idiots. I went to do this. I left there with the thing turned around. They were concerned about me. About 3 hours later, the crime bureau showed up, and those people didn't do anything but answer questions for a while. And the newspapers picked it up because of the funny paper name, Dog Patch, and Panther Creek Church, and the church burning. And a reporter went over in the area to try to interview some people around one of the taverns, and they sicked a dog on him. And naturally, he went out and wrote a real jazzy story. I mean that added to the mystique and the backwoods.
Riley, we're just down to a couple of minutes. You're going to wind this up real quick?
Well, the whole deal is, everybody would suggest that ruined your ministry, didn't it? No, it didn't. Now, some of those people went to jail. The killer did. Life imprisonment, recently paroled. I baptized his daughter, baptized his wife. I preached his father-in-law's funeral. In other words, when it got all said and done, I made it clear that I would do anything I had to you, but I'll do anything I can for you. And I made that clear. And right now today, those people are my friends. Some of them are still on the shady side of things. And if they need any serious pastoral work, I'm the guy. Now, my point is that I don't believe that you sacrifice your witness by standing opposed to that which is wrong, even if it's a firm, hard line. And I think we need to deliver that message to the enemies of liberty and of the faith from abroad and in our own country. It's the Lord, like I say, a lot of this is humorous now. If I tell it to a group, there's a lot more laughs. But there was not any funny stuff at the time. And I look back now, and the misery that this situation put my wife through is terrible. But she didn't have the confidence in the neighbors and the dogs that I did. And so I'm grateful that it happened, and the whole thing is that the church is still there. Everything is in good shape, and I thank the Lord for that. It's a little out of character for the ministry, but I look back upon it now, and I believe that this venture in faith, that I was uniquely qualified because I was local. The local moonshiners even sided with me. I mean, they kind of helped serve notice that, look, this guy's all right, don't pull that rough stuff on him. Besides that, he's not from Indiana or Ohio, he's from here. And he's got relatives that lives down the river, so be careful what you do. And so this way, I have one real live gunslinger that
Riley, in the next 30 seconds, you encourage somebody else to take a venture in faith.
Let me tell you, you can't solve all the world's problems, but you can help with the three big ones. You can tell people how your sins can be forgiven, and how you can be raised from the dead, and how you can face the judgment and not be afraid. And with those three problems solved, the rest of them are kind of insignificant.
Riley, thanks for being with us.
Pleasure's mine.